Welcome back to the show, everyone. We're continuing our deep dive into the Bible today. Picking up where we left off, exploring those alternative narratives and hidden truths.
Yeah, those hidden truths. And in the past couple of episodes, we've really started to see the Bible through a different lens, haven't we? Questioning some of those traditional stories,
Mhm.
really digging into the historical and cultural context.
For sure. And today we're going beyond those familiar ideas about the Anunnaki. We're going to move past some of those Zechariah Sitchin interpretations to think about some, really thought-provoking theories about who they were and what their role was.
Yeah. And to guide us on this deep dive, we have Humanity's Ancient World, Progenitorship, and the Ethics of Suffering. This article really challenges the way that we think about the Anunnaki, like suggesting they weren't extraterrestrials, but maybe an advanced species right here on Earth.
Okay, so let's get this straight. If they weren't aliens, then who were they?
Well, the article kind of proposes they might have been a humanoid species, perhaps even similar to the Homo sapien paracus.
The Homo sapien paracus.
Yes.
Those individuals discovered in Peru with those, unusually elongated skulls.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
not little green men from Mars, but beings who walked among us, potentially even contributing to our own lineage.
It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? And the article goes on to suggest that the Anunnaki, they possessed superior cognitive abilities, perhaps even a mastery of what they call frequency manipulation.
Frequency manipulation. And what exactly does that mean?
It's a bit of a head scratcher, I'll admit, but think of it as like the ability to harness and control energy in ways that we can barely even imagine.
Okay.
Some researchers even suggest that this could explain the construction of those megalithic structures, those that baffle archaeologists to this day.
You mean those massive stone structures found all over the world, like Stonehenge and the pyramids?
Exactly, yeah.
You're saying the Anunnaki might have had the technology to build those?
Well, it's one of the intriguing possibilities the article explores.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they did possess this advanced knowledge, what happened to them?
Right.
Why did their civilization seemingly vanish?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
And the article suggests that the Anunnaki's demise may have been linked to, a power struggle with early humans.
Yes. A power
Oh,
struggle.
wow.
Yeah, the article paints a rather dramatic picture of, well, basically a human rebellion against the Anunnaki, potentially leading to the destruction of their advanced society and the loss of their incredible technology.
So kind of like that story of the Tower of Babel, where humanity's ambition leads to their downfall.
It's an interesting parallel, and the article even draws a connection to, like, modern political discourse. The idea of the masses blaming the ruling elite for their suffering.
Okay, so you're saying that this ancient power dynamic, this resentment towards those in control, might be echoing through the centuries, shaping our political landscapes even today.
It's a thought-provoking concept, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It really leads us to another intriguing point the article raises, the biblical flood.
You mean Noah's Ark and all that. What does that have to do with the Anunnaki?
Well, the article proposes that the flood, a story found in many cultures, might symbolize the destruction of the Anunnaki's world, perhaps as a consequence of that human rebellion.
So not just a natural disaster, but a cataclysmic event triggered by this ancient conflict. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, it is. And the article doesn't shy away from challenging, conventional thinking. And it goes on to suggest that this event ushered in a period of technological regression,
Okay.
essentially forcing humanity into a kind of de-evolution, loss of that advanced knowledge passed down from the Anunnaki.
De-evolution. So we went backward, we lost centuries of progress.
That's the theory the article proposes. Makes you wonder, if remnants of this advanced civilization did exist, where are the traces?
Right. If the Anunnaki were such a powerful force, surely they would have left some kind of mark on the world.
Well, the article suggests that some of those traces might be found in unexpected places, like, the elongated skulls in Peru.
Right.
And the advanced knowledge attributed to, ancient civilizations like the Inca and Egyptians.
So maybe those elongated skulls aren't just a genetic quirk, but a sign of Anunnaki heritage. Or perhaps those ancient civilizations inherited fragments of Anunnaki knowledge, leading to their remarkable achievements.
Both are intriguing possibilities. And the article really does leave us pondering the potential connections between these seemingly disparate pieces of the puzzle.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about ancient history.
And speaking of rethinking things, the article brings up another fascinating connection, this time to ancient texts, like the Sumerian Ludlo Bel-Nemeqi and the Biblical Book of Job.
Okay. Those are two texts I'm not familiar with. What's so special about them?
Well, both stories delve into this question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Why do the righteous suffer? The article suggests that these texts, despite their different cultural origins, might offer insights into how ancient people grappled with the trauma and upheaval, potentially caused by the Anunnaki's demise.
So these stories aren't just abstract philosophical musings, but reflections of a real historical event that shook the very foundations of human society.
That's the idea that the article proposes.
Wow.
And it makes you wonder if these ancient tales might hold a deeper meaning, like a hidden code waiting to be deciphered.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of history, uncovering secrets that have been buried for millennia. So tell me more about these texts. What kind of stories do they tell?
Well, Ludlo Bel-Nemeqi is a Babylonian poem. It dates back to around 1700 BCE, tells the story of Shubshi-Meshroshaken, a nobleman who, despite his piety and devotion to the gods, endures just a cascade of terrible misfortunes.
So he's a good guy who gets dealt a bad hand.
Exactly. He loses his health, his status, his peace of mind. But what's really fascinating is that he never loses his faith.
Even in the face of such suffering, he clings to the hope of divine intervention.
Yes. And eventually, through his unwavering devotion to the god Marduk, he finds restoration.
All right.
It's a powerful story about the importance of faith in the face of unimaginable hardship.
It sounds like a very human story, even though it's rooted in a completely different time and culture.
Absolutely. And it resonates with another ancient tale, the Biblical Book of Job.
Job.
Ugh.
Isn't that the guy who loses everything and then gets it all back?
You've got the basic outline. Job is portrayed as a righteous man who, through a series of devastating trials, is stripped of his family, his wealth, even his health. It's a profound exploration of suffering and the struggle to maintain faith when confronted with, unimaginable loss.
So both Ludlo Bel-Nemeqi and the Book of Job present us with protagonists.
Yeah.
Who are essentially good people suffering for seemingly no reason.
Exactly. And that shared theme, that exploration of unjust suffering, is what makes these texts so compelling even today.
Right.
They force us to confront that age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? A question that continues to resonate throughout human history.
And the article suggests that these stories, these reflections on suffering, might be directly linked to the upheaval caused by the Anunnaki's disappearance.
Precisely. Imagine the impact of losing such an advanced civilization.
Right.
The worlds as they knew it would have been shattered. Their sense of security, their understanding of the cosmos, everything would be called into question.
It's like the rug was pulled out from under them, leaving them grappling with fear, uncertainty, and a profound sense of loss.
Exactly.
Wow.
And in that kind of environment, it's natural to seek explanations.
Right.
To search for meaning in the midst of chaos.
Yeah.
These ancient texts, these stories of suffering and redemption, might offer a glimpse into how our ancestors processed that trauma, how they tried to make sense of a world that suddenly felt unpredictable and dangerous.
It's amazing to think that stories written thousands of years ago could still hold such relevance for us today.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper into these texts, we'll see how they not only reflect the anxieties of the past, but also illuminate some uncomfortable truths about our own society and the ways we often respond to those who suffer.
I'm definitely ready to dive deeper into these texts and see what other hidden truths we can uncover. But I think we should pause here for a moment and give our listeners a chance to digest all of this incredible information. We'll be back in the next part to explore the nuances of these ancient stories and see how they might be influencing our attitudes towards suffering even today.
The island states are awry, Battle Mage. Please go there. They need help from powerful sorcerers like you.
Welcome back to our exploration of the Anunnaki. And those profound ways that these ancient theories might connect to our understanding of suffering. Before the break, we were just starting to discuss those two fascinating texts, the Sumerian Ludlul Bel Nemeqi and the biblical Book of Job.
You really got me thinking about how those stories, though written, thousands of years apart, they both grapple with this universal question. Why do good people suffer? It makes you wonder if there are, some fundamental truths about the human condition that transcend time and culture.
It's a really powerful observation. And, as we kind of delve deeper into these texts, it becomes even more apparent that despite their shared theme, there are also some, striking differences in how they approach the problem of suffering.
Okay, so what are some of those key differences? We talked about how both protagonists, Shub-Shemesh-Roshakan and Job, are depicted as, righteous men who endured terrible hardships. But how do their experiences differ?
Well, one of the most significant differences lies in the nature of the divine. Ludlul Bel Nemeqi, being a product of Babylonian culture, reflects a polytheistic worldview.
Okay, so Shub-Shemesh-Roshakan is appealing to Marduk for mercy, but there are other gods out there, some of whose might not be so, benevolent.
Exactly. His suffering could be attributed to the whim of a particular god, a cosmic imbalance, or even, just plain bad luck. The world is depicted as a place where multiple divine forces are at play, and human fate is often subject to their, capricious nature.
Whereas Job's story is set firmly in a monotheistic tradition, with a single all-powerful God at the helm.
Precisely. And this raises a whole different set of questions.
Right.
If God is good and all-powerful, why does he allow Job to suffer? Is it a test of faith? A punishment? Despite Job's insistence on his own innocence, the Book of Job grapples with the problem of suffering within the context of divine justice and the mystery of God's plan.
So both stories wrestle with that same fundamental question. Why do bad things happen to good people? But they do so from different angles, reflecting their distinct cultural and theological frameworks.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And these different perspectives have a profound impact on how the protagonists understand their own suffering and ultimately find a path towards healing or resolution.
Speaking of healing, does Shub-Shemesh-Roshakan ever find relief from his suffering? Does he, eventually get a break?
He does. After enduring, unimaginable hardships and pouring out his heart to Marduk, he experiences a restoration of his health and fortune. It's a classic tale of redemption. The good guy suffering, but ultimately finding favor in the eyes of the gods.
Okay, so it sounds like a, satisfying ending. A confirmation that even in a world ruled by multiple deities, faith and piety can lead to, a positive outcome.
In a way, yes. But there's a crucial detail in Ludlul Bel Nemeqi that kind of sets it apart from the Book of Job. And it has to do with the role of community.
Oh. Tell me more about that. How does community play into Shub-Shemesh-Roshakan's story?
Well, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of his suffering is that he's completely abandoned by those around him.
Oh, wow.
His friends, family, even his community turn their backs on him, leaving him utterly isolated in his pain.
That's terrible. So not only is he dealing with physical and emotional suffering, but he's also experiencing, the profound pain of social rejection. It's like being kicked when you're already down.
Exactly. And this isolation adds a whole other dimension to the theme of unjust suffering. It's not just the gods who seem indifferent to his plight, but even his fellow humans have abandoned him.
Yeah, it paints a rather bleak picture of human nature, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
But how does this compare to Job's experience? Didn't he have, those friends who came to comfort him in his time of need?
He did. He did. But their comfort is questionable at best.
Okay.
They spend most of their time accusing Job of wrongdoing, insisting that his suffering must be a punishment for some hidden sin. They offer judgment and condemnation instead of genuine empathy.
So not exactly the kind of support system you'd hope for when going through a crisis.
Not at all.
Yes.
And their inability to truly understand and acknowledge Job's pain, it adds another layer of suffering to his story. It's almost as if they can't handle the idea that bad things can happen to good people, so they need to find a reason, a justification for his suffering.
It sounds like they're projecting their own anxieties and fears onto Job, using him as a scapegoat to maintain their own sense of order in the world.
That's a very insightful observation. Their judgment of Job allows them to distance themselves from his pain, to create a sense of separation between his experience and their own lives. It's a very human response, but not a very compassionate one.
And it's a response we still see playing out today, isn't it?
Oh, Oh, absolutely.
That tendency to blame the victim, to distance ourselves from suffering that makes us uncomfortable.
Absolutely. It's a pattern that repeats itself throughout history and continues to shape our societal responses to those in need. Think about how often we try to rationalize suffering, to find reasons why people deserve the hardship they experience.
It's true. We hear it in the way we talk about poverty, homelessness, addiction, mental illness. There's this underlying assumption that people are somehow responsible for their own suffering, that they've made bad choices or haven't tried hard enough.
And by focusing on individual failings, we often fail to acknowledge the systemic factors that contribute to suffering, the social and economic structures that create barriers and perpetuate inequality.
So it's not just about personal responsibility. It's about recognizing the role that social structures play in shaping people's lives and opportunities.
Exactly. And this brings us to another area where those ancient patterns of blame and judgment often rear their heads: welfare programs.
Those programs are designed to provide, a safety net to help those who are struggling to make ends meet. So how do those patterns manifest in that context?
Well, think about the way we often talk about welfare recipients. There's this tendency to portray them as, lazy, entitled, dependent on handouts. We create narratives about welfare queens and deadbeat dads, reinforcing the idea that those who receive assistance are somehow less deserving, less worthy of our respect.
And that leads to policies that are designed to punish rather than empower, doesn't it?
It does.
All those bureaucratic hoops to jump through, the
Yeah.
constant scrutiny and judgment.
Exactly. Instead of offering a hand up, we create systems that make it even harder for people to get back on their feet.
Yeah.
We demand that they prove their worthiness, perform their suffering before they can receive assistance.
It's almost as if we're saying, we'll help you, but only if you can convince us that you're not one of the undeserving poor.
It's a dehumanizing approach, one that perpetuates the cycle of poverty and reinforces the idea that suffering is a sign of moral failing.
It's a far cry from the kind of, radical compassion we see modeled in figures like Jesus, who consistently reached out to the marginalized and the suffering, without judgment or conditions.
That's an important point. Jesus challenged the social norms of his time, offering dignity and love to those who were ostracized and rejected. He didn't demand that people prove their worthiness before offering them a seat at the table.
It's a powerful example of how we can choose to respond to suffering with empathy rather than judgment. But it's easier said than done, isn't it? These patterns are so deeply ingrained in our culture, in our very way of thinking.
It's true. Breaking free from these patterns requires a conscious effort, a willingness to examine our own beliefs and biases. It's about recognizing those moments when we're tempted to blame the victim, to distance ourselves from suffering that makes us uncomfortable.
So where do we start? How do we begin to dismantle these harmful narratives and create a more compassionate society?
I think it begins with awareness, recognizing these patterns, understanding their historical roots, and seeing how they manifest in our own attitudes and behaviors. Once we start to see the problem clearly, we can begin to challenge it, to speak out against injustice, and to advocate for policies that promote equality and opportunity for all.
And perhaps most importantly, it's about choosing compassion over judgment in our everyday interaction.
Yes.
It's about remembering that everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about and offering grace and understanding instead of, criticism and blame.
Beautifully said. We may not be able to single-handedly solve the problem of suffering in the world, but we can choose to be a part of the solution. One act of kindness, one gesture of empathy at a time.
It sounds like we're about to move into a discussion about how these ancient patterns of blaming the victim play out in our modern world, particularly in our economic and social systems.
It's a crucial point. After all, if we're going to create a more compassionate and just world, we need to understand how these deeply rooted tendencies manifest in our social structures, our economic policies, even our everyday interactions.
So let's get specific. How do those ancient patterns play out in, our modern economic systems, for example?
Well, consider the foundations of capitalism.
Okay.
It's a system built on competition, individual achievement, the pursuit of material success.
Right. That idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, working hard to, get ahead.
Exactly. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with, ambition or striving for a better life,
Right.
the problem arises when this relentless pursuit of individual success comes at the expense of others.
So it becomes a zero-sum game
Right.
where one person's gain is another person's loss.
In a sense, yes. And when that happens, it's easy to fall into that trap of blaming those who are struggling, to see their economic hardship as a sign of, personal failing rather than a consequence of systemic inequalities.
Like we're back to those friends of Job accusing him of wrongdoing instead of offering,
Yeah.
compassion and support.
Precisely. And this blame takes many forms. The idea that poverty is a result of laziness, poor choices, a lack of personal responsibility. These narratives, they allow us to maintain the illusion of a just world, a world where, people get what they deserve.
But those narratives ignore the systemic factors,
Mm.
That contribute to poverty. Lack of access to education, healthcare, affordable housing, living wages. All those things play a role, don't they?
Absolutely. By focusing solely on individual behavior, we avoid confronting that uncomfortable truth. That our economic systems, they often create and perpetuate inequality. We fail to see how those systems, create barriers to success for those who are already disadvantaged.
So it's not just about personal responsibility. It's about recognizing the role that social structures play in shaping people's lives and opportunities.
Exactly.
So where do we start? How do we begin to dismantle these harmful narratives and create a more compassionate society?
I think it begins with awareness. Recognizing these patterns, understanding their historical roots, and seeing how they manifest in our own attitudes and behaviors. Once we start to see the problem clearly, we can begin to challenge it, to speak out against injustice, and to advocate for policies that promote, equality and opportunity for all.
And perhaps most importantly, it's about choosing compassion over judgment in our everyday interactions. It's about remembering that everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and offering, grace and understanding instead of criticism and blame.
Beautifully said. We may not be able to single-handedly solve the problem of suffering in the world, but we can choose to be a part of the solution. One act of kindness, one gesture of empathy at a time.
It's a powerful message and a fitting reminder as we wrap up our deep dives today. We've explored some, complex and challenging themes, but I think we've also uncovered some valuable insights into the nature of suffering and that enduring human quest for meaning and connection.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners will continue to ponder these questions, to challenge those ingrained patterns of blame and judgment, and to choose compassion as their guiding principle in a world that so desperately needs it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into, the heart of the human experience. We'll be back next time with a new set of sources and a fresh perspective on the world around us.